Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video I have combined two previously published videos. So the first one that you will see discusses colonialism and imperialism as two concepts, and the second video covers what is called neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. And so the reason I'm putting these three terms together is to give you in one video three major concepts of post-colonial studies. Now, I have not done much editing. I've just put them together, so please bear that in mind. And if you would like to rather watch them as individual videos, they are also available on the channel as two separate videos. That's all. Thank you so much, and let's delve into it. Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be spending a few minutes in explaining two important concepts related to post-colonial studies, and those are colonialism and imperialism. Most of the times we use them interchangeably, but there are clear differences between the two concepts, and I thought I should make those clear. So colonialism, as defined by, and I'm using someone's definition of it, is a practice of domination, of course, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. So the difficulty in defining colonialism is that it is hard to distinguish it from imperialism. And the two conflicts are frequently conflated. Like colonialism, as for example, imperialism also relies on dominance, relies on economic and political dominance. So maybe, according to some scholars, if we go to the roots of the term, the etymological roots of the term colonial comes from colonus, right, which is a Latin word, which literally meant a farmer. So that meant that when a group of people were transported from one part of the world to another part of the world as maybe captive workers, as farmers, and to work that land, they therefore became the colonizers, right? And now these people, of course, may not have gone to a new land of their own free will. They might have been taken as slaves, but that act of appropriating another land and peopling it with farmers brought in from outside was part of the colonus and could be expanded from there to the definition of colonialism itself. So then, keeping that definition in mind, colonialism is a mode of appropriating resources and land from another part of the world by a power that has the power to do so, maybe through military dominance, maybe through conquest. What it involves is one power physically actually occupying another people's land and then extracting from it the agricultural and other resources. So an act of colonialism then literally always involves an actual conquest and the direct implementation of a system brought in by the conquerors, the colonizers. Now, another important thing to keep in mind for what we study as colonialism in the post-colonial studies is that we primarily focus on the 19th and 20th century colonialism. And the reasons for that, if I try to define them, are that it coincides with the rise of capital. First the mercantile capital and then the later stages of capitalism. And hence the colonial enterprise by European power is deeply connected to the rise of capital and the demands of capitalism, which is raw materials and human bodies and human labor. And so in that sense, that is why most post-colonial studies scholars see colonialism as something that involves an actual occupation, conquering, and appropriation of another land by the European colonizers, and then that act enables them to establish local systems of government, local systems of coercion, and local systems of extracting the raw materials or the agricultural products from the lands that they have conquered and colonized. So the distinction being that they actually hold the ground, they actually run the territories that they control. Now, coming to imperialism, imperialism, of course, comes from the Roman Empire, from the term imperium, right? Which Roman system of imperial government, which was, of course, implemented militarily. But when we study the 20th century and 19th century colonialism, imperialism is more of the ideological mindset, right? It's the mindset or self-perception of nations that convinces them that they are somehow superior, right? And hence have the right to either take over other lands and civilize them. So it uses the vocabularies of the civilizing mission, or just believe inherently that their systems, their race, their ways of doing things are superior, and they have either the moral responsibility or the right to implement that way of governance, that way of thinking the world, that way of dealing in the world on other people. So if you look at 20th century imperialism and colonialism, all colonialist movements were guided by these ideologies of imperialism, ideologies of racial superiority, ideologies of religious enlightenment, and ideologies of bringing culture and light and civilization to these so-called heathen lands. A great example of that kind of mindset or that kind of mentality is the Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden, which he writes on the occasion of the American conquest of the Philippines, in order to convince Americans that they should now take on this thankless mission of building their imperium through colonization in the Philippines. So overall, to sum up, both the concepts are interconnected because one feeds into the other. Colonialism actually employed physical occupation of the peripheral parts of the world by the European powers. And its aim was to extract resources, agricultural raw materials for the increasing demands of capital in the metropolitan cultures. That is why when we say post-colonialism, what we mean is that physical occupation ended in different parts of the world after the Second World War. Imperialism is an ideology, it's a mindset, cultural and individual. And that mindset gives the members of a certain community this idea that they are somehow superior, or they have a superior mission or a superior system, they understand the world better, and then they attempt to implement that system on other people. And that never ends, right? Because it's an ideology, and because it's a cultural mindset, because it's a cultural way of looking at their global others. So hence, it still underwrites so many aggressive things in the developing world by the so-called developed world. And it underwrites so many activities, political and economic, of the developed world. So these are some of the distinctions between the two terms. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if I've left anything unsaid, I'll put links to the sources for these two terms in the description. But if you have any questions, please add it in the comments. And if you like what I'm doing on this channel, please do subscribe so that you get timely notifications of what's coming up every now and then. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Hello. Today, in my series on postcolonial concepts, I'll briefly talk about neocolonialism. I had talked about neocolonialism in my recording about neo-imperialism, but I thought I should focus it a little more about its genealogy and where the term came from. So the term was first introduced by Kwame Nkrumah, who was the leader of Ghana as it became independent, in one of his crucial works that was published in 1965, which is called Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. I'll post a link to the book in the description. Now you can already tell that the last stage of imperialism part of this text comes from the famous essay by Lenin, which is about monopoly capitalism and the last stage of imperialism. Now, what Nkrumah argued in his book and eventually also in his public statements was that while actual colonialism had ended, the influence of the colonizing powers still remained in the colonies, and in some forms actually became more insidious because it could not be easily discerned. And by that, what he meant was that the economic influence of the former colonial powers still remained, still played a role, and that the old regimes also had a cadre of comprador governments, governments run by people whose sympathies were aligned with the former colonizers. They were part of the native elite who was educated and trained by the colonizers and whose interests were usually at a divergence from their own people. And these were the very people that the former colonizers were now using to exploit the native people of Africa. So the term was very pertinent to Africa and African, Pan-African leaders, but it's also used in Latin America as well as in the South Asian conflict. And literally what it means is whenever the former colonies, even after they have left the colony, still have a direct influence in the free and independent nations that are developed after colonialism through their economic policy or through their economic influence, but also through the works and power of the native elite that they leave behind. Now, if you have watched my lecture on Chinwezu on Ariel and Caliban, that is the struggle that Chinwezu also tries to highlight, is that in the post-colony, the biggest struggle is the fight between Ariel, who was left behind by the Europeans, and the Caliban figure, who are the actual native inheritors of the freedom itself, and how to balance the system in favor of Ariels. Now, in the later stages, post-1980s, and even after the fall of Soviet Union, United States and its influence, both economic and political in the world, is seen as the main influence in this neo-colonial regime. And US does that by actually direct invasion of countries like Iraq and now maybe Iran, but also through its economic policy, not just through aid or through forcing or coercing smaller nations to bend to its will, but by also enticing new and emerging governments to follow its economic policy, also the economic instruments, the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank. United States has a lot of say in it. And now increasingly, as the US leadership basically claims that whatever they do in the world is to safeguard the American primacy and American privilege in the world. So those policies are seen more and more as neo-imperial and neo-colonial policies. And the reason they become neo-colonial is because they literally, even without physically being there, they can shape the local politics and policies. So overall, I think this clarifies the subtle distinction between my earlier take on neo-colonialism, but this neo-colonialism whose intellectual genealogy lies with the African leaders, especially with the work of Nkrumah, and their insistence that even though the colonial powers leave, their influence lives on, within the post-colonies in the shape of the policies, the economic policies, and the local regimes that still promulgate policies and govern that necessarily is not in the interest of their own people, but is in the interest of their former colonizers, and now, of course, in case of the current global world power, United States. These are some of my ideas about this concept. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the description or in the comment section below. And for today, that is all I have. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.